I have more things to say about Pokémon Legends ZA. Editing Mallory here. So we ended up getting a last minute Nintendo Direct on March 27th, and I filmed all of the footage you're about to see in this video on March 22nd, not knowing that was coming. And I went back and forth about whether I should edit this video or just scrap it, considering we had gotten new info. But after looking at it, I still think a lot of the things that I have to say are still relevant and things that I want to bring to the conversation. There are definitely a couple of things that obviously changed my perspective a little bit, but also could still be completely relevant. So you can keep that in mind when watching this video. Again, I still think a lot of it's relevant, but it did happen, so I'll try to add a couple of things here and there. First of all, thank you. I know that 20,000 views is not some spectacular achievement on YouTube. I am not new to this platform. I have been on this platform now for the better part of 2 decades as a consumer and a watcher. I've only been really trying to make content here for a few months now, so this was really encouraging to me, so thank y'all for watching. If you're unfamiliar with me, if this or that last video was your first time seeing any of my content, I have been making content specifically about Pokemon, intersecting topics like history, archaeology, lore, mythology for several years now at this point, on TikTok primarily, as well as in spaces like Twitch. So it's just really encouraging feedback that people were willing to watch my content, engage with it. They had positive feedback, so hopefully you'll like what I have in the future as well. I have more thoughts I wanted to say about Pokemon Legends ZA as I've let it marinate for a few more weeks. This video is not going to be as long as the previous one. Again, I would recommend that you go back and watch that if you want to see some of my deeper analysis over the trailer and the information that we got on Pokemon Day 2025. This is actually going to be more of a video looking at things that we didn't see, because I've been thinking about the things that we don't know, which is a little bit of a scary place. One of my major criticisms of Pokemon content creators as a whole is that they love to fill in these gaps and they love to claim their hypotheses as fact, which is frustrating because it creates this sense and this belief in the community that these things are definitely going to happen, and it often leads to letdown, which I find incredibly frustrating. I love hypothesizing, I love speculating, I love theories, but I think it's important to remember that they are just theories. Theories are super fun. I love to theorize. I love to talk about history, about mythology, and all of these things to get us to think critically about these spaces. I love critical analysis of Pokemon, and I love to see other people jump in and join in on that. So I love to have these discussions. So hopefully you'll find this interesting. Maybe you'll have some thoughts. Maybe this will get something moving in your brain that will have you thinking about what we could possibly be seeing in the coming months. Like I said, this is really going to be a discussion more on what we haven't seen, and then a little bit look at some Easter eggs and some little small things that I've noticed. So without further ado, let's get into it. So I went back and looked through the trailer, and I wanted to look more closely at the Pokemon that we've seen in the trailer specifically. And you can go to all of the different various websites that compile Pokemon information, like Pokemon news websites, and they've put this together. But I do want to sidebar really quickly and mention that something that drives me crazy with many of these websites is that when we see a Pokemon's pre-evolution, they assume that by default we will have that Pokemon's evolution. Is it likely? Absolutely. Is it confirmed? No, it's not. We have known for a long time now that Pokemon can have branch evolutions. This is not a new concept. We have Pokemon now, especially looking back to like PLA, where the starters did evolve into Typhlosion and did evolve into Decidueye, but they were different forms, so they weren't their original forms. So I just think it's a really important thing to note that there's always room for these branch evolutions, for these divulgence in these different evolutions, and it just drives me absolutely crazy. We haven't seen Watchog, so I have Patrat here. Who knows if Watchog will be in the game? So we see Pokemon, we see baby Pokemon, we see early evolutionary stages. Now there are some complete stages that we have seen, but if we've only seen one, I'm not willing to bet the farm that we will see the whole line just yet. Again, is it likely? Yes. Is it confirmed? No, not yet. But specifically, I went through and I compared all of the Pokemon that we have seen and I looked them up, and all of the Pokemon that we have seen in the Legends ZA trailer are Pokemon that we previously have confirmation were in X and Y. Specifically, they've been in Kalos before. So all of these Pokemon, save the starter trio, we are going to get to that, are Pokemon that were first introduced between Gen 1 and 6 because they are Pokemon. They were the only Pokemon we knew about at the time. We didn't know the 8th generation Pokemon yet. So we didn't have anything new in here aside from the starters. But even still, the starters are all starters that predate the 6th generation. Now, on the one hand, I'm sure this is in part a marketing technique by them not showing any new, if you will, Pokemon, either completely new or new to this region. It will allow them to do that in marketing later, which I'm sure will be beneficial, but not at all have they done something as simple as just showing something like a little Fido walking through Lumio City, and I find that interesting. But I do want to talk about how Pokemon has been doing this sort of retconning, where they are essentially rewriting the canon, adjusting it so that these Pokemon have always existed. We've always known about these Pokemon. And so I think it's beneficial to the story. I don't think it's a bad technique, but we've had this in plenty of different places. And this has been going on for the last few generations. So like PLA is an example of this, although it's a little bit unique and a bit different because we're factoring that this game does take place in the past. So it's kind of hard to compare this one specifically, but we had evidence of this here. An example would be that we had Rufflet, and then we had Braviary, which did evolve into a Hisuian form of Braviary, but we had Rufflet, which was previously introduced in the 5th generation. Another super famous example that I want to get into that some people may criticize is in Pokemon Journeys, the anime. And again, I know that a lot of people, myself included, don't really recognize that the anime is part of the same timeline or universe in the multiverse of Pokemon as the games are. But in Pokemon Journeys, a central hub for the main characters in Journeys is the Cerise Lab, which is in Vermilion City in Kanto. Chloe, one of the main characters, this is her dad's lab, but it does contain Cerise Park, which houses all different kinds of Pokemon, and specifically Pokemon from all different regions. Obviously, the Cerise family themselves have a Yamper, but there's Rotom, there's Piplup, there's Morpeko, there's Kecleon, Feebas. There are tons and tons of Pokemon from all different regions. And the point of this is just that it basically adjusts the canon to show that, like, oh, again, like, sure, there are tons of Pokemon that were originally discovered in the Kanto region, but like, of course we know there are other Pokemon that have existed in other regions. They just don't exist here. And so it's just that whole discourse on understanding that they're kind of working to do all this retconning, which again, I think is beneficial to the story. I think it will also, from a gameplay standpoint, be more beneficial so we can have things more like national dexes, which I know a lot of people want. So I think it's a beneficial thing, but it's just kind of rebuilding and relaying that foundation. I also personally think that the introduction of regional forms in the 7th generation was a really clever way to support this as well. And then of course, again, circling back to PLA and Pokemon that we saw in Hisui, despite Sinnoh looking very different in the future. And then now if you want another game example here in the 9th generation, so far we specifically have Blueberry Academy from the DLC of Scarlet and Violet, but Blueberry itself is located inside of the Unova region. And of course, this is like this school over in the water, and they obviously brought these Pokemon in and created this like terrarium-like element. But again, it's just like confirming like, oh, kids in Unova, we've seen Pokemon from other regions. Yeah, like we know that there's only so many here in Unova, but of course we've seen these Pokemon from Paldea before. Of course we've seen these Pokemon from Alola before, or we know they exist. Again, I genuinely think it's a beneficial thing. This is not a criticism of this. It's just kind of showing this foundational groundwork. So when we look at Lumio City, when we look at PLZA and how so far we haven't seen any of that here, I find that very interesting because I would think we would expect to see some Pokemon. Again, I mentioned like Fido. I know there's like a fan art going around that I think people are mistaking as canon, and people are talking about, I think, like a croissant version of Fido or of Darkspun. But I think that there are plenty of Pokemon that would fit very nicely into here. And again, if we go back to the concept of the wild areas, which we talked about in the last video, I just think that Pokemon are going to have to be imported basically and brought into Lumio City, because while there probably are Pokemon that are native to Lumio City, creating wild habitats and then placing Pokemon in them is, I feel, going to be a very direct action. So I'm just interested to see if we're going to see more of this retconning and more of this evidence of like, oh, these Pokemon have always existed together. I think a lot of this is going to come down to the entire discussion about like if there's going to be an expansion to Megas, which I think a lot of people are optimistic for and believe. We've obviously seen a bunch of different Megas so far, but they are all Megas that we know before. So people are hoping for and banking on more Megas being added to this game. And so I'm sure that will be an indicator, but I also think it's important to note as well, I did mention PLA, but as far as the PLA deck goes, it's not super diverse. It doesn't have a wide range of different Pokemon. So we're going to have to see if they're going to actively, strongly retcon this, or if it's really going to just hold the line in Kalos. I want to also note I'm really curious about what fossils are going to look like. We did see Aerodactyl in the trailer. And of course, it does have a mega evolution, but we did not see the other fossils that we know are native to Kalos. And again, just fossils as a whole, obviously going back again to PLA, we had those time-space vortexes where Pokemon existed and occurred and came from. I don't think we're going to see that in the same way here, and it'll just be really interesting to see how they connect these things. And I am also really curious to see, depending upon which Pokemon they bring in, how this might impact things like regional variants or even convergent evolutions. Obviously, we've seen this pretty big expansion with the concept of convergent evolution really present now in the beginning of the 9th generation. We obviously have the introduction of Wiglet. We literally got an ecological panel on that. And we also have Pokemon like the Toadscroll line. So I'm curious to see, again, if we'll see that here. That's actually what I'm personally banking on more than necessarily Kalosian Pokemon. I said this in my last video. I'm of the belief that we will see Kalosian final evolutions of our starters. I am not so sure that we'll see that across the board everywhere, but I think that we could potentially see convergent evolution. That would be kind of that retconning. So maybe an 8th gen Pokemon will see something very ecologically similar to it here that wasn't previously here. But additionally, in PLA, we saw several Pokemon that had either no evolution or just simply had an evolution added to it. So an example would be adding Ursaluna to the Teddy Ursa line, or like Quillfish previously having no evolutions, as well as Basculin having no evolutions, getting Overquill and Basculegion. But then of course we had Pokemon like the Hisuian form of Sneasel that ultimately evolved into Sneaseler, as opposed to the Jotonian form of Sneasel that evolves into Weavile. So again, I think there's room for all of it. I'm not sure if we're going to see a ton. I really am curious, but again, I just found it very interesting that we didn't see any new Pokemon in this space. And again, I do think that it could be connected to just something as simple as marketing. They can definitely do an entire new ecological panel. They can do an entire trailer where they just reveal a Pokemon like they've been doing for many past games. But I'm curious to see why we haven't seen literally anything new, being anything from Gen 7 on so far. Now I want to pose this question. Is there another legendary? Editing Mallory again. Obviously, this is a very big component of what I was talking about in the beginning of the video, where this changed perspective. But I really thought about it and looked at it all. And just because we have this system that is going from rank Z to A from a battle perspective, I don't think it necessarily negates what I said, though. You're going to see in the footage where I said it can mean multiple things. And so while we do have the context of this battle system, I don't think that's going to be the entirety of the game. There's obviously an entire story, which is really where my points are going into, is more about the story and not just battle. Or maybe I wasted all my time. I said this in the last video because the game is ZA. And now again, it could be a play on a lot of things. Obviously we have literal AZ, which also could be a reference in this. And then we have the concept of A to Z, Z to A. We have, moving through a story or moving through an entirety of something. But again, it's in reverse. And I just find it very interesting that we have this Z, which in my opinion is stylized to be indicative or representative of Zygarde itself. And then we have this letter A, and I saw it last year and I've been thinking about it since last year. This A just seems like it's indicative of something. People have been saying since last year, maybe the A is representative of the ultimate weapon. I don't think that's a crazy leap. I've kind of wondered the same. It kind of has that same structure and shape and even maybe color scheme. And people have pointed out that it seems like Quasartico Inc. is built where Lysander Cafe used to be. And I mean, I also said that I think Quasartico is evil. I think that that reveal is going to be the least shocking thing in this game. So would it surprise me if the ultimate weapon comes back up? No, not even a little bit. The technology for the ultimate weapon has existed for at least 3,000 years in this region. So it's been part of the history of Kalos for 3,000 years. So to see it again would not be at all shocking. But again, I just can't let go of the thought that this is a legendary. Every game we've had in this region, we did have X and Y, and obviously the box legendaries have a silhouette that represent those letters, and then at the same time, so does Zygarde. So if they're doing another letter, am I being a hypocrite after I ranted about pattern recognition in the last video to say that I think the A is indicative of a new legendary? So I want to get into this before we get really deep into it. So we have Zygarde, which is identified as the Order Pokemon. These three are collectively known as the Aura Trio because of their Aura abilities. Xerneas is a life-bringing Pokemon and Yveltal is a destruction Pokemon. And it's true that we often see pairs of legendaries be in conflict with each other. We could look at the Hoenn legendaries that were land and sea. We had time and space in Sinnoh. And then we usually have a third that maybe lords over them, or that is some kind of mediator between them, or even worse is a deceiver between between them. So, but I think people might be quick to say, oh, Zygarde is the order Pokemon, which I've always interpreted as, you know, the order between life and death, because these are natural things that occur, but there needs to be order because too much life, let's say, or too much destruction can be harmful in either way. So there's a balance and there's an equilibrium in that. But I don't want to jump to saying that it's going to be a chaos Pokemon because, again, I don't think that Zygarde needs to have an opposite or a conflict. I think Zygarde exists between the two, but I don't think that we need to have an order and a chaos Pokemon. So that is still just open for interpretation. I also want to point out in PLA how we had the origin forms now added for Dialga and Palkia. So we've had an origin form for Giratina for a while, but now we have an origin form for all three of those at that trio. And then, of course, we had the forces of nature had presence in the Sinnoh region, and we had a new force of nature added, or that we were told about that we didn't know previously. So there really does seem to be a space for the legendaries to expand. And what I find most interesting is a lot of people who have been mad about the fact that this new Legends game is not taking place in the past, is they're like, well, then why are we calling them Legends games? And when I look at the expansion of what has happened with legendary Pokemon, it seems pretty straightforward to me. But also, I think to define legend as only being something of a story from the past is limiting. Like, the word obviously has multiple meanings, so we don't need to reduce it to a very finite understanding. But again, even still, so there's obviously a pretty big emphasis on what we saw in expansion in the legendaries in that game. So I just think there's room to believe that there's expansion in these. So I've been doing a lot of research and I've been talking to a lot of people and I've been taking a lot of notes, and I want to walk through what I'm thinking as far as this A could potentially be. So let's take a closer look at the box legendaries from X and Y along with Zygarde to understand them a little bit better, so you have a little bit more context to see kind of the theory that I'm going to pitch here. Like most Pokemon, these legendaries have many inspirations. Most Pokemon have many different things that it seems that they pull from to create the design. But one unifying theme between all three of these is that they seem to be connected to elements of Norse mythology. Now, I'm going to say this, my mythological understanding is pretty vast, but I know almost nothing about Norse mythology. My expertise, my specialty, my academic background is going to be primarily in Mesopotamian, and it's expanded into places like Japanese and Chinese culture. I also have some insight into like Native American, Indigenous American mythology, but when it comes to Norse mythology, I am not the expert here. And with all of that, I'm going to apologize in advance for my pronunciation. I'm going to do my best to say these words as properly as possible, but I know I'm going to misstep. So I just apologize preemptively. So starting, we have Xerneas, which is the life Pokemon, and it in part seems to be inspired by Turnir. And I'm going to put the words up so that you can see them all, as well as these four that I'm not even going to begin to pronounce. But basically, Turnir is a stag that stands upon Valhalla in Norse mythology. And next we have Yveltal, the destruction Pokemon, which seems to be based heavily off of Valgar, which is a Jotun, which are like these superhuman, supernatural kind of giant entities, and they're often contrasted against the gods in this mythology. And Yveltal's design seems to again take inspiration from this one Valgar, which takes the form of an eagle specifically. And then we have Zygarde, which is the order Pokemon, and it has three forms. And all three of these forms seem to be connected because they seem to be inspired in part by the children of Loki and Angrboda. And I'll just put their names up here as well. And so they're three different creatures, and we see those creatures reflected in the three different forms we have of Zygarde. So Xerneas brings life, Yveltal brings destruction, and Zygarde brings order. So, but I want to zoom in on this A in the logo because it's really why I'm obsessed with it. We have this green design, and it looks like a life-bringing entity. Like we have these little, sprouts at the bottom of it. And again, would it make sense to just compare it to the ultimate weapon? Because the ultimate weapon was originally created to bring life back, to restore Floette. So I did what any normal person would do, and I asked my Discord. I have a lot of very intelligent people there. So this is what we came up, and these are some of the different entities and deities inside of Norse mythology based on my line of questioning that we seem to think maybe could be where some inspiration is drawn from. A core element of this is thinking about a Pokemon that can be designed to create an A silhouette. Obviously, again, the original three, we know that their forms have a silhouette that is created based on that letter. So I'm thinking of a Pokemon that it can essentially create some kind of shape that looks like this, basically. So I'm gonna start first with Yord, and I know you have to roll the R. I'm sorry. I've never been able to roll my R's. My music teacher used to hate that I couldn't do it. So this creature is basically the personification of Earth, basically like akin to Mother Earth to the best of my understanding and other forms of mythology, and is also a creature that is the mother of Thor and the partner of Odin. So her name means things like land or like earth, and so it's kind of straightforward, but it's like a creation myth point in the story. And so I'm thinking kind of something removed from all three of these, something that might potentially lord over all three of these. So if we're taking things back to like the Norse creation myth, then I think we might see something. Not something that would necessarily lord over Pokemon like Arceus or Dialga, Palkia, any of those, but in this space, life and death are elements in our world. And then the order that can be created between them, the natural process of those things. So, I was thinking something like a life bringer in some capacity and like the origin of life bringing, if that makes sense. But this concept of like a Mother Earth like entity, I feel like is inherently antithetical to the concept of urban redevelopment, which may be what would like shake it into it needing to be present in the world. And so it's also a humanoid creature. And I think a wide stance, picture a humanoid creature like standing with their legs spread out can make an A shape very easily. But I also know that people really love to dog on and hate humanoid style Pokemon. And that almost feels like a little too straightforward. But I think that could maybe be a concept of inspiration. Another thought I had is Angrboda, which I mentioned earlier, which is another Jotun. But I specifically bring her up because she is the mother of those three creatures that I mentioned earlier. And those three creatures seem to be in part heavy inspiration for Zygarde's three forms. So having a creature that is inspired by the mother of Zygarde, let's say in the biggest air quotes, seems like it could be also kind of direct and also a potential inspiration. And I want to point out specifically that on the Pokemon website, on the Legends ZA page, we see all three forms of Zygarde on there, which, I mean, we obviously know all three of those forms, but I find it interesting that they put all three of the forms on the page, which makes me think it's going to be an important part of the story. Again, we might just be collecting the cells and it might be as simple as that. But if we have all three forms, is it drawing attention to the fact that there are three of them and maybe a mother that created them? Leaning into the chaos element a little bit, I really don't think it would necessarily be a chaos Pokemon. We technically already have chaos Pokemon, but Angrboda's name has a bunch of negative connotations to it, like things like Griefbringer and She Who Brings Sorrow. So it could be that connection, again, if it's something that's not necessarily like a foil per se of Zygarde, but is different in that sense, maybe we would see those ties in there. And I also want to talk about the etymology. So the Boda part is a cognate for the English word bode, as in this does not bode well. And I just feel like if there's Angrboda influence, urban redevelopment does not bode well, I feel like that would be interesting. One of the members of my Discord as well referenced a story of Angrboda, and I believe that they said they thought it was in fiction, so I don't want to claim it as definitive Norse mythology. Like I said, I've not really read any Norse mythology, so I don't want to speak incorrectly or in ignorance. But the story that they knew about Angrboda was that she retreated to like this desolate wood that had been destroyed. And as she lives there over time, the woods return to life. And like as she lived there every year, like they spread out more and more. And again, just thinking of this urban redevelopment concept and the harms that it may cause, having a creature that brings nature life to a space that is maybe a concrete jungle feels like it could really fit well. Now, the last creature from Norse mythology that I want to talk about is called Edimbla. And this is a primeval cow in Norse mythology. And it played a pivotal role in the Norse creation myth with things like the formation of the first gods and the Jotun. So again, this is a bovine creature and it had udders that essentially created rivers of milk that there were entities that were able to survive from. And so I want to point to this creature specifically. It's very much like a cosmic creature to my understanding, but her design I think is so perfect because I think it could so easily be adapted to create the A. Once I was introduced to this entity, all I could think about was that its horns could be horns that point inward, the way that obviously Xerneas's point very outward. If they pointed inward, there's your letter A. And maybe that's a really simple concept, but again, thinking of something that leads back to the origin of this region, the origin of sustainable life in this region and all of those different things, I think any of these could maybe help tell the story and create a legendary Pokemon that is in some way over all of these or has dominion over this area and is there to ultimately preserve everyone, maybe not just Pokemon, but everyone. So people have noticed that this game has now pulled for basically the first time ever in the mainline series an E10 plus rating for fantasy violence. I think Pokemon Rumble are the only other games that have pulled this rating, but basically everything else has just been E-rated. But again, as far as like the mainline series are concerned, this is the first time we've ever had E10 plus, which is kind of crazy to think about because these games have had heavy themes. And I'm of the mindset as an educator and a former teacher myself that children are more than capable of understanding complex issues. I personally hate when we like dumb things down and assume that a younger person can't understand something. But we've had environmentalist discussions, we've had, ethical discussions about Pokemon and their use, and all of these things have existed in the Pokemon universe since the beginning of the series. We've had mob bosses, we've had loss of life, we've had lots of different things that I've experienced in these stories, but the games have consistently pulled this E rating. Editing Mallory here again, just really wanting to point out that maybe the whole concept of the E10 and fantasy violence is solely related to this battle stuff. I'm still going to go ahead and share my thoughts on this rating, but I am kind of leaning more towards it really is just because we're going to have this really overt battle presence and this nighttime brawl energy that really might just be the answer to that question. So I'm sitting here thinking like what could possibly cause that, because again, it's not like these stories don't have heavy themes. I mean, again, if you played through Scarlet and Violet, spoiler alert, but we find out at the end of the story that Professor Sada and Professor Turo, they were not alive at any point in the story, and they had already lost their life to an incident with Koraidon and Miraidon, which is pretty gruesome because I'm guessing it wasn't pleasant or simple. So keeping that in mind, there's so many things that could probably impact this. I'm wondering if it's just the upping of the graphics, to put it in a simple sense, but I'm thinking specifically lots of people have been talking about it. Lots of people thought this is where the game was going to go, but if we're going to see more content about the Great Kalos War from 3,000 years prior to the events of X and Y. People were so mad that this isn't where the game went, so I hopefully think that they'll enjoy that. I would love to see a closer look into the war, or perhaps AZ will maybe rehash things that have happened, but we have gotten lots of glimpses both in the game and in different parts of the anime. Like we have shots showing the Pokemon fighting, we have the ultimate weapon going off, but again, the rating is for fantasy violence, and I wanted to better understand specifically what that is. And essentially it basically means, like magical violence, like something you'd see in Sailor Moon versus maybe something you'd see in Death Note. So we'll have still cartoony stuff, not super realistic, but Pokemon are inherently magical again. So we've seen Pokemon battling and fighting since the very first game that we played. So I think getting more glimpses of the war is probably like everybody's guess as to why we'll see this. I don't necessarily think there's going to be something gruesome. Again, it's fantasy violence, so it's going to have to be inherently magical or cartoony in some way. I know certain people really want these adult themes to be present in Pokemon. I really don't myself, but it does make me optimistic for the story again, because I just like to see deeper understanding grow. And again, if we're getting a closer look into some of these things, who knows what it could be? Again, we've literally had villains who have tried to end the world. So how this is the game that's pulling that rating, I genuinely don't know, but I'm excited to see when we get more info. Like most totally healthy and functioning people, I have watched this trailer 6 million times and I have assessed every little angle. And so I wanted to get into a couple of things that I've noticed that I don't really have full thoughts on. I want to just talk about, I want to give reference to, and we'll see if we end up seeing more about these in the future. Editing Mallory here again. This is the section that I probably have scrapped the most footage from post trailer. It's just little things that I wanted to talk about, but I still feel like they're fun. So I've kept in some of it and it's kind of just scattered thoughts. So first off, I caught this little shot in the trailer. It's 6 seconds in to the gameplay, and I think it's probably nothing, but I'm going to make it something for now. We talked about the anti-homeless bench in the last video, but I want to point to this. You can see this little blocked off sign or mark in some way that is on this building or this wall early in the trailer. Now, it could simply be, again, they're going through urban redevelopment, so it could be that a building is been condemned or it's being renovated, so it's telling people they can't enter it. But what if it's tagging? Now, I know that the content that I'm making right now is not very evergreen because in a couple of months, probably before the summer's end, we're going to have a much closer look at more about this game. And all of these theories could just be nothing when it's all said and done. But I just am so adamant that Quasartico is bad, that the urban redevelopment plan is going to have some haywire elements or it's going to be nefarious in some way. So I just believe there's going to be resistors to this. So I just want to pose the question, is it someone tagging? Is it someone speaking out against the urban redevelopment? Is it someone condemning it and saying this is bad, stop Quasartico? That's where my mind is leading, but again, it's probably an unnecessary and kind of crazy leap. Now, I want to take a moment to point this out. I haven't seen anybody else talking about this, and maybe they have. This is not claiming that I'm the only person who thought of this, but we obviously see the 3 starters, but then when they show off each Pokemon, they show them in a distinct background. So we see these different backgrounds, and my question is, do you think that that is indication or insight into what these starters are going to evolve into? I know I've said it. I know a lot of people have said it. A lot of us think that they're going to get regional evolution. Some people are still holding on for megas, and that is totally possible. But I just think seeing each of these 3 shots maybe is indication or some kind of little teaser, little Easter egg about what the evolution is going to look like. I just wanted to point this out. Again, I haven't seen anybody else talking about this. I'm not saying I am the only one, but I am just thinking about Easter eggs, just thinking about little teasers in that sense. So I just wonder if that is any kind of indication of things that we might see in the future. And the last thing I want to point out is, of course, this shot that we got in the trailer, the extended footage that shows what looks like it's going to be bringing back the Looker Bureau, which I think a lot of people are excited for. I don't know a lot of people if they always play through post-game of stories or if they really get like the full complexities of those. I know there are plenty of people who play base game and never play DLCs and all of that. So getting this little glimpse, I think maybe would be really cool. It'll also be a really good nod to X and Y, as if this whole game isn't. But I wonder too if it'll maybe set the timeline, because I feel like this might be conversation we'll have with NPCs that'll say, oh, there was a kid just like you 10 years ago. That might really solidify the timeline of where this game occurs. But I literally still have people to this day. I literally had someone today try to make the case in my comments that PLA is the past, just like Scarlet, and PLZA is the future, just like Violet. Even though Scarlet and Violet do take place in the present day, they just have things that exist in the future and the past. Either way, we are going to have to see what the Looker Bureau and all these other little things give us. Obviously, I've decided to exhaust content from 7 minutes, 8 minutes of game footage, but I would assume we'd see something hopefully in the summertime. So maybe we'll get a new Pokemon reveal. Maybe we'll get a little piece of the story. Maybe we'll see evolutions, and hopefully we'll get a little bit more insight so that I can analyze this game until I can't analyze it anymore. Like I said at the beginning of this video, I really appreciate all the people that have joined in and have watched this video and have left positive comments and have enjoyed this discourse. I love to engage in this kind of critical analysis in Pokemon. And so if you enjoy it, I would love for you to consider subscribing. I am working, like I said, on more evergreen content. I have done lots of extensive content analyzing individual Pokemon, concepts of archaeology, history, mythology in Pokemon on other platforms. So I'm working towards moving more content here for people to watch if they are so interested in. So keep an eye out for that in the near future. Here's another video YouTube thinks you'll like. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.